Connection problem. There's a problem with the internet connection between you two. Hold on while we try to get the call back. Are you there?
Yeah, but you're blurry now.
Just continue with your live. We're open.
We're live,
Yeah,
eh?
Open.
Well, we're live, so welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics.
Talk to that camera.
I'm your host, Dr. Richard Miller. The mission of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics is to expand consciousness, stimulate thought, enhance physical and mental well-being, and encourage community. Typically, at this time, I give you a brief introduction to our guests for the day, and then I do news and notes in psychology and medicine. Today, I'm going to dispense with the news and notes. It was about air, it was about water, and it was about sugary drinks, and I'll bring it to you next time. The reason I'm dispensing with that is because I want to give even more time to our guest today, Michael Krasny. It's my privilege to have him on the program. For those of you who are not familiar with his work, if there are any of you who are not familiar with his work, Dr. Krasny is the host of the award-winning KQED Forum, a program discussing news and public affairs, current events, culture, health, business, and technology. Michael's program, Forum, can be heard daily on Northern California's public radio station KQED, as well as on Sirius XM satellite with National Public Radio, Comcast digital cable, and on the internet as a podcast on iTunes. Michael's abilities and reputation as one of the world's finest interviewers are enhanced by his creative work as an author and as an educator. A former regular contributor to Mother Jones magazine, Michael has contributed a great deal of fiction, literary criticism, and political commentary. He's the author of Off Mic, a memoir of talk, radio, and literary life, Stanford University Press, which was, by the way, on both the San Francisco Chronicle and the Marin Independent Journal bestseller list. His book, Sound Ideas, was with Maggie Sokolek, if I pronounced that correctly, I hope I did, and Let There Be Laughter, which is going to be the topic of our book today. I can go on, and I think I will, because Michael's contribution to broadcast journalism is enormous. I'm actually awed to be with him, and I say that knowing him for many years and considering him a friend. I told him before the show that when I did the research for this program, I came up with a list. If I can put this on, I don't know if this is going to get on the screen, but this is a list, single-spaced, of some of the people he has interviewed over his career. And the list includes such people as Gore Vidal, Kurt Vonnegut, Al Gore, Camille Paglia, President Barack Obama, Paul Krugman, Madeleine Albright, Harry Belafonte, Alec Baldwin, Joan Baez, Richard Avedon, and I could go on and on. In fact, I could probably take the whole program just reading the list of the people that Michael has interviewed. And the same for his literary awards, including Mayor Art Agnos of San Francisco declared Michael Krasny Day in San Francisco way back in 1990. In 1994, Mayor Frank Jordan did it again, and again by Willie Brown, Mayor of San Francisco. In 1990, the California State Legislature, and again in 2003, the California State Senate passed resolutions honoring Dr. Michael Krasny for public service. And these awards have gone on and on until most recently, in 2014, he received an award from the Radio Television News Directors Association, and he was recently, in 2016, presented the Barbary Coast Literary Award. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Michael.
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. The book we're going to talk about today is is Let There Be Laughter. But before we do, I want to remind you that some over 10 years ago, when I told you I was going to be doing a radio and then becoming a television broadcaster, you said to me, well, watch out for becoming a demagogue. And that was a good warning. It was a way of saying, don't stir up people's emotions rather than stimulate their thoughts. Don't try to be a rabble-rouser. And you have really walked a beautiful line in your interviews over the years. And I want you to say something about your philosophy and how you've managed to do that, how you've managed to stimulate thought without, let's say, unnecessarily rabble-rousing and raising people's emotions while you're doing so.
Well, thank you. I think I'd have to be candid by saying I don't necessarily follow my own advice. There are times when I've probably stirred up emotions and maybe even been a bit demagogic, although now we have a new president who gives new meaning to that word demagogue. I think, though, what I've tried to do and what I've been in many ways quite earnest in trying to do, and even sometimes passionate, is you talk about walking a line, is to be a good journalist and to be essentially a good interlocutor. And what that means to me is bringing light, bringing knowledge above all. So the biases that I may have, although they can creep in and subversiveness can come sometimes into the picture, are at least as devoid from the discourse, at least that I try to encourage and have tried to encourage in my career, as I can possibly make them. And that's what I think good journalism ought to be.
And when you're not on air as the interviewer, when you're being interviewed as you are today, do you feel comfortable citing your views? I know you made a reference to our newly elected president. Can we talk about that a bit? Is that comfortable for you?
It is comfortable, and I don't necessarily wear that journalist hat when I'm talking about a book I've authored or when I'm just speaking to another interviewer, as I am now with you.
Well, what are your feelings about, or have you summed them up in the comment about being the demagogue in chief? Do you want to say anything more about the presidential election, or should we move right on to the book?
Well, we probably should move on. I think it's... Let me just say diplomatically and thoughtfully, I hope that this is a very serious time for our republic, a time to really consider where we need to go, how we can possibly unify, especially given the divisions and the long, harrowing nature of that campaign, toxic nature of that campaign. I think we're going to have to find ways to go to our better natures, to the I hope that citizens will take that on. Pardon?
There was a slight break in the transmission, but you're okay now.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, I think that people would have to try to at least address their better natures as best they can and find some kind of amity and civility. I think we've left a lot of that in the lurch in this campaign, and I simply hope we can get on a better footing.
Well, along those lines of a better footing, laughter serves a weighty purpose. It gives us lightness at times of darkness, and you've written a book called Let There Be Laughter. Want to give us a little background first on how you came to the book?
Before I give you background on that, I just want to really reinforce what you just said, Richard, because laughter, and I'm sure you know this as well as anyone from the work you've done, can be very healing. And it can not only reduce stress, but there was a recent article in the Phi Beta Kappa Journal, the American Scholar, about how laughter, there's been a long period of hypothesizing that it's good for our cardiovascular and immune systems. It may even be good for our endocrine system, it turns out. And in other words, laughter is good. It's the old Reader's Digest, laughter the best medicine. I think, there are better medicines for specific ailments, but it's good medicine, and it really helps us deal, and it helps us stress, and so forth. This book was not a missionary or a proselytizing project to try to give laughter to the world. It came out of an interest specifically in Jewish humor, because I realized I had a great repository of Jewish jokes. And I thought, what do I do with all these jokes? And not only that, but I think when you start to write a book, it's often because something ignites in you that's curious or that wants to pursue a question or a number of questions. Questions in my mind had to do with, why are Jews so funny? and why have there been so many dominant in the world of popular culture, particularly American comedy and American humor, but also what's the nature of the humor, and what does it reveal to us? What does it tell us about not only, say, collective identity, but universal identities? Because a lot of these jokes, which I call Jewish jokes, translate and go over different boundaries to many different groups, ethnic groups, and also Jewish humor has become in many ways a big part of American humor. You think of the major figures in American humor, stand-up obviously, but also in comedy and performing in television and film, and a disproportionate number of them have been Jewish. Coincidence? No, I don't think so. 2 or 3% of the population, but I think it has a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do maybe even with epigenetics, who knows? But I wanted to get at some of those tough questions. And I also wanted to bring laughter. I think I do. And there's some hilarious material in this book. None of it my own, except some anecdotes which I sprinkle into the book, which I thought would give it some life and give it some spice and so forth. And from what I'm told, at least by thoughtful readers, it has done that. But for the most part, it's kind of a work of scholarship and a work mainly inspired by, I hate to bring up this name because it's a red flag to many people, but probably more by Freud than anybody else.
No red flag for me personally, as you know.
Well, it's a red flag for many in your profession, understandably so. He's worn out his welcome with many people. But he did write a pretty, I thought, enterprising and illuminating book called Jokes in the Unconscious, or Wit in the Unconscious, depending on your German translation. And what he was trying to say was that humor, and particularly jokes, which are narratives really, can provide all kinds of interesting notions of how humans release aggression, anxiety, sexual repression, anger, and so forth. And I kind of took that and ran with it. And I also wanted to get behind, what do these narratives tell us? I teach literature, and literature is essentially teaching of literature is essentially finding meaning, motifs and leitmotifs, and deconstructing narratives and finding essentially how to interpret them and analyze them, which is essentially what I did with humor.
Yeah, there's a theory that because of the diaspora, there was no central place for Judaism, that what kept the Jews together and has kept them together for so many thousands of years had to be something other than a physical locale, other than a Washington, D.C., although now there is a homeland, and that part of what has kept them together a great deal has been the teachings, but also the humor has kept the culture together, and that's part of what you talk about in your book, the cultural aspect of Jewish humor.
I think culture and humor and the connection between the two of them have had a great deal to do with the enduring, call it collective identity or tribal nature of the Jewish people. And I separate Judaism, the religion, from Jewishness, the identity. The identity has been maintained even with great assimilation and secularizing, and in fact a lot of the assimilation and secularizing is grist for the joke mill, as you've discovered perhaps by reading my book. But there's the old notion that humor has also been the antidote for suffering, because Jews have been through a great deal of persecution and pogroms and genocide and so forth. And then there's also a joke that says, boy, if I hear that one more time about Jewish humor being the suffering, I'm going to kill myself. Or humor being masochistic, I'm going to kill myself. But it has sustained the people, and it's done the same for many people. The Irish, Sal Bellow once said they're an oppressed people, and their humor is very similar to Jewish humor. They were an oppressed people, and humor sustained them to a great degree. A friend of mine, to drop a name, Isabel Allende, the fine Chilean novelist and writer, said to me, Chilean humor is just like humor. I don't see much difference between them. And the Chilean people were also under subjugation and went through a good deal of oppression as well, going all the way back to the conquistadors and forward to, well, before her namesake Allende took over, Pinochet. So there are many people that can identify with what you have described here, which is creating a sense of longevity for a people by the power of humor.
Give us an example, please, or maybe more than one example, of a joke having to do with suffering, Jewish suffering.
Well, there are a lot of them, but of course they go back, many of them, to the shtetl, to the European pogrom. There's a shift that I write about in my book, especially when Jews find themselves in the United States and succeeding and not being under the persecution and oppression that they went through for so many centuries. But I like to use the example of the two Jews who are in front of a firing squad, and they're about to be shot. And one says to the other, "Don't we get a last request? I want to ask for a cigarette." And the other one says, "Shh, you want to get us in trouble?" It's a joke that speaks to not only the passivity and fear that comes out of suffering and out of oppression, but the sense that there's always going to be trouble, even when you're probably on the cusp of being shot to death or killed. There's still the concern that you have that the other that makes you into the victim and makes you into the scapegoat will somehow do something to you. That's a very revealing joke in many respects.
There's a joke that you told me many years ago that I'm reminded of when you tell that joke about the bee that's sitting on a branch, and he's wearing a Jewish skull cap, a yarmulke, and this fly comes by and he sees this bee wearing a Jewish skull cap, and he does a double take and he spins around and he lands right next to the bee, and he looks at him and he says, "Hey bee," he says, "are you wearing a Jewish skull cap?" And the bee says, "Yes, I certainly am." He says, "Why? Why, you're a bee. Why are you wearing a Jewish skull cap?" And the bee looks at him and says, "I wouldn't want to be mistaken for a wasp."
It's a little bit of a silly joke, but it's a fun joke, and
Yes.
you tell it very well.
Well, thank
And,
you. But it's also
the sense of
yes.
difference in that joke is really quite important. It's that sense that Jews feel, well, for a long time there was the idea of being the chosen people, and I think that was distorted and created a lot of chauvinism and self-congratulation and feelings of superiority.
And anti-Semitism. A lot of anti-Semitism came from that.
A lot of anti-Semitism because, anybody says we're superior, we're chosen. But the real meaning of it is we were chosen by God to essentially take the Torah and make it our law and make it what we believe in. And the Jews weren't even the first choice on that score. They were the second choice of God on Sinai. But chosen, like Tevye says in Fiddler on the Roof, chosen for what? For pogroms and suffering and difficulty and barely making a living and so forth. So you have that binary in the Jewish culture of the sense of differentness being special and differentness being special in the sense of self-laceration and self-humiliating and all of the rest of it. It's a very sharp contrast. But so much of the humor has to do just with the sense of being different, because when you're singled out, and centuries go along of being singled out one way or another, or you feel different just by nature of your religion and your minority status and marginality and victimization, that's what you feel.
When you mentioned about being different because of the chosen people selection, I'm reminded of a story I read about ancient Greece, where in the gymnasium the men they exercised totally naked, and Jewish men who wanted to be part of the gymnasium felt so much apart from the Greeks who they worked out with that they actually attached make-believe or prosthetic foreskins to their penis so that they would look as though they had not been circumcised. And there was evidently quite a business going on with those who manufactured these foreskins for attachment when going to the gym. I thought that was a rather interesting and extreme example of attempting to assimilate.
Well, there are many of those examples, and in fact, you find it in the humor of the Jewish people. Let me give you one that it's probably the only, other than when I appeared on the Friday Forum program. I do the program 4 days a week, and Mina Kim is now the host on Friday, and I was on her show as a guest talking about my book, Let There Be Laughter. And at one point, she said, "Have you ever told any of these jokes on air?" Because there's a lot of jokes in the book. And I said, "Only one," and it's a simulation joke. And I told it when I had Vikram Seth, the Indian writer, on as a guest. Who's a wonderful novelist and poet. And I told it because he had written a memoir about his uncle, who was, of course, also from India, who had married a Holocaust victim, a woman. And the uncle was a dentist, and they had a very assimilated life in England. And I was prompted because of that to tell this joke, which is still one of my favorites. And the joke is, it takes place actually during the Shoah, the Holocaust. And a gentleman, a young man, actually escapes from the Holocaust, and he finds his way to the UK, to Britain, crosses over, and does very well. But he's worried about his old father, who's in the Warsaw Ghetto, and who's probably, he knows, about to be taken to the gas chambers or to the showers for Zyklon B or some other type of extermination. So he stages a very daring rescue of his father and brings him into England and says to his father, "Pa, I've done well here. This place has been a sanctuary for me. I've prospered. And I think of myself as an Englishman. I know it's going to be difficult, but I want you two to think of yourself as an Englishman." And so the first thing he does is takes his father to a haberdashery and gets him suited up in a beautiful, actually, three-piece suit. And then he takes him to a tonsorial place and gets his hair cut, and the barber starts cutting his payasses, you know, the curls that the Hasidic Jews wear, the Orthodox or more pious Jews, I should say. And the old man starts sobbing, and sobbing convulsively, paroxysms of crying. And he says, "Pa, tell me, why are you crying? Because you're losing your Jewish identity?" He says, "No, I'm crying because we lost India." So there's your assimilation joke. It's pretty fast assimilation.
So I heard you say that the lady who fills in for you or covers the show on Fridays asked you about telling jokes, and you said you rarely do on your own program. Did I hear that correctly?
You did, and the reason is we discuss mostly fairly serious topics.
Right.
Bertolt Brecht, one of my dramatist heroes, a German playwright, said, "The man who laughs has not yet been told the terrible news." And the truth of the matter is, when you cover news topics and current events, you're dealing with a lot of very serious subjects. It doesn't mean you can't bring levity into it, and I try to, certainly, but we deal with policy and we deal with things that are happening, particularly on a national and state level, as well as international, and pretty serious topics for the most part.
Yes, they are. So here is your opportunity today. I'd like you to tell jokes galore, and I really would. And I. Pardon?
My book could have been subtitled "Jokes Galore," although the truth is, the publishers, being marketing minded, said 100 of the greatest Jewish jokes of all time. That's right on the cover.
Yes.
And I think the mistake some people made was to think, it's another Jewish joke book, of which there are a number. But it's not just another Jewish joke book. It's a book about the meaning of humor and the history of humor and the cultural anthropology of humor. It's a very, in many ways, actually serious joke book, but nevertheless a serious book.
It's a serious joke book. I agree with you, because as I was reading, for example, the section on Jewish mothers and grandmothers and the jokes that are made about them, and I'd like you to tell a few of those, I realized there's a great deal of misogyny involved. There really is. There's a great deal of put down, and it is sort of funny, but in a way it's sort of painful at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I did try to take account of that and note the. I mean, you have to, when you talk about Jewish mothers and grandmothers. On the one hand, and most of these jokes are made up by men. There's pretty little doubt in my mind that that's the case. A lot of them reflect misogyny, and a lot of them reflect male chauvinism, and a lot of them reflect, again, a kind of feeling of male superiority at the expense of women. But they're all too easily dispensed with as being negative in those ways, because a lot of them also speak to the protectiveness and the over-adoring nature and really, shall we say, overprotectiveness in the real sense of associated with Jewish mothers and Jewish grandmothers. So there's a kind of binary to them. Then I found myself writing about the Jewish American princess jokes, which were pretty much lambasted as being anti-Semitic and misogynistic. And then it occurred to me that a lot of these jokes are about Jewish women who are now grandmothers or great-grandmothers themselves. They were of almost a certain era. The mother jokes and the grandmother jokes have morphed into helicopter mothers and tiger mothers and all of these other kind of phenomena that we associate with overprotective and over-adoring and maybe, shall we say, overly ambitious mothers. But I also saw a different side, particularly to the mother and grandmother jokes. I saw that a lot of them reflected a kind of pride, male pride, in success in America, saying our mothers, our grandmothers are materialistic. They, like the old juke, juke would be an interesting word to invent. Old joke
Is
about
that a Jew
the
by a
man.
joke is a juke? Maybe that's what you were
Yeah,
doing
it's
there.
right. Like the jukes of the Calicax.
That's right.
The joke about the guy who said, "Please cremate me," and that's against the Jewish religion, and put my ashes in Bloomingdale's so that way I know my wife will visit me at least, 3-4 times a week. Or the guy who says, the joke, which I'm sure is from a guy, husband dies and they say you can pay for his obituary by the word, and she hems and haws and says, okay, Mort died, Volvo for sale. But these jokes also reflect a kind of sense of Jewish women as being tough and practical minded. It's almost a kind of strange tribute to that practical mindedness. I'll give you the classic joke, which is actually, I think, very funny, but also disturbing to many people, as you suggested. It has a kind of binary quality. It's a joke about a Jewish man who's on his deathbed, and his daughter is there, his beautiful daughter, by his side. And he's dying, and he smells kugel, which is a noodle dish that Jews love, and it smells very good. And he says, he can barely even talk, he says, I smell kugel. And his daughter says, yeah, Mom is making a kugel. And he says, just to taste your mother's kugel once before I die. And she says, of course, Daddy. And she gets up and runs into the kitchen. And she's gone for quite a time, and he's hanging on by gossamer threads. And finally, she comes back, and he's literally at death's door. And she sits down, folds her hands, and says nothing. And he can barely speak and says, where's the kugel? And she says, Mom says it's for after.
Yes.
It's another version of this. Mom says it's for the Shiva, for the people will come and mourn and pay their respects. It's an indicting joke on the one hand, and maybe laced with a kind of misogyny, but it's saying, she's looking ahead. She's being practical. She's realizing her husband is going to be deceased, and she's thinking about what she has to do after. A lot of these jokes do reveal much more than I think they're often seen on the surface to reveal, especially in our politically correct and politically sensitive times. There's a joke which I'm sure you know, for example, about the Jewish mother who joins a pretty serious kind of Sierra Club hiking group. And they trek up this big Himalayan type of mountain, and they get to the top, and she can barely make it, and she's infirm and old and aging, but she makes it to the top. And the leader of the group says, there's a venerable and highly respected wonderful guru who lives in a cave up here, or guru if you prefer. And he said, all of you can go in and see him and say just three words to him, because he's a nominalist and he only allows 3 words to be said. Please go in and pay your respects to the guru, but only 3 words, please. And they file in one after another, and Mrs. Rabinowitz files in. She comes out, and the leader of the Sierra Club type group says, Mrs. Rabinowitz, you saw the guru? Yes, she says, I saw the guru. And you said 3 words to him? She says, yes. Do you mind if I ask what those 3 words were? I said, Sheldon, come home. All right. Now, the name Sheldon has kind of gone out of favor in terms of nomenclature, but what the joke really reveals is a Jewish mother heaping on guilt on the one hand, stop living in this cave, but also saying, come back to your roots, come back to where you belong, to your Jewishness, and your Judaism. I told that joke to Ram Dass, and I said, this could have been a joke prototypically that you could have assumed.
That's right, exactly.
I told it to Peter Coyote, too, who is a friend and who is now a Zen priest. But there's, again, that multiple or multivalent meaning to a joke like that.
And there's more than that, in addition, if I may, which is also, it's a joke about Jewish assimilation, because we have this word in the culture, shoe-boos or Jew-boos.
Or bagel Buddhists.
Yes.
Yeah, it's another kind of way, though,
of so many
saying,
Jews becoming Buddhists.
Come back. Yeah, that's
Yes.
what I was trying to intimate.
And why do you think so many Jews have moved towards, or I don't know so many because we don't know real numbers, but it appears like so many have been
Especially here, Northern California.
in Northern California, interested in Buddhism. Have you thought about that? How do they pick Buddhism? What is there about that that's so attractive that Peter Coyote, a Jewish man, becomes a Zen Buddhist priest, for example?
Or Ram Dass.
Or Ram Dass.
Jack Kornfield, or, you can go on with the list.
Yes.
A lot of the lead Buddhist thinkers. And it's a tough question to answer singularly, because people are drawn to, I think, drawn to the meditation and the practice and things of that sort, maybe even more than, I'm not sure Buddhism is a religion. If you talk about Buddhism and all the mythic old forms of polytheism, I suppose you could call it a religion, but in many ways, it's become more of a practice and a way of life. But I think secularization is a lot of the key to that, and wanting to do good. A lot of Judaism, at least in its theology, has to do with mitzvahs, with good deeds. And Buddhism is very much, and Christianity too, I mean, most of the major religions want to do good, or at least stress doing good, despite the fact that they war with one another and they kill and maim.
Yeah, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln. Yeah.
But at least those who accept a lot of what the belief is trying to present into practice are saying do good. I mean, it's a core of so many.
Yeah, yeah.
And Buddhism is a way of translating that, it seems to me, into a practice and a nature of adhering to essentially precepts which Buddhism lays out.
I'm concerned, Michael, about the number of jokes that have the positive meaning about their sons of Jewish mothers. They have the positive meaning of how proud they are and how much they love them. But they also portray the women as being so demanding, so perfectionistic, and we'll move on to another topic of so blingy, if you will. But on the demanding and perfectionistic, I'd like you to tell the joke about the boy who's drowning and he gets pulled in, and what the mom says to him after the boy is resuscitated.
Let me say something in preface to telling that joke. And I spent an evening with Calvin Trillin, who is a pretty famous writer for The New Yorker and author in his own right of many books, many really fine books, about all kinds of things, humor, but also cooking and food, and he's a culinary expert. And we spent an evening at the North Theater recently in San Francisco trading jokes and talking about Jewish humor. And the joke that you cite here, he said, I would disagree with him about this, but he said, is one of the few distinctly and sui generis Jewish jokes. And the reason is because, well, let me tell the joke and then see if it really, in your mind or in the minds of your viewers or listeners, could possibly translate to other ethnicities. Because there's something in it about the quintessential, or what's seen as the archetypical Jewish mother or Jewish grandmother.
Yes.
I tell it about a grandmother, but it could be either one. So let's say it's a grandmother, and she's at the beach with her son. And the son has one of these, shovels and pails, and is putting sand in right by the ocean. And suddenly a big wave comes in and takes the kid and takes him into the ocean. And the grandmother is beside herself. I mean, praying, and she can't swim, and in terror. This is her grandson. This is her, what we call nachas, her pride and joy. Absolutely imploring God, or whomever might be listening, or whoever might be within earshot, to come to her aid. And sure enough, miraculously, a young, very Teutonic-looking lifeguard comes and appears and dives into the water, brings the kid out, the kid's blue, gives him mouth to mouth, and brings him, essentially resuscitates him, brings him back to life, because it looked like he was gone for a while. And the lifeguard says to the grandmother, he's going to be okay. I want to reassure you, he's going to live and he's going to be fine. And she nods and she moves her hands from the prayer position, and she solemnly says, he had a hat. Now, is that, something that translates to another culture? Because so many of these jokes really do translate to other cultures. Unless they have Yiddish in them, like the Japanese guy who hears that his wife is having an affair with a Jewish man and says to her, I hear you're having an affair with a Jewish man, and she says, who told you this mishigas? That's a joke that really brings in Yiddish and spices it up in a way that says but it could translate into other.
It might translate, but here it's about a Jewish mother, and we have this, entire series of Jewish mother jokes. It sounds incredibly demanding and ungrateful,
and it does
right?
sound demanding and insistent, but it's also, again, what I argue, practical. Okay, God has done his will, or we've gotten this out of the way, the kid's going to be okay. Let's concentrate, let's focus on what we need to focus on, which is just the practical. Kid should be wearing a hat on his head. It might get cold. He should have a hat because it keeps him from getting some kind of It's a
Of
kind of
course,
immune system.
and you don't waste the money on the hat. Okay, let's do a similar analysis about your joke about the Jewish mother who is attempting to get her daughter, guilt sling her daughter into not going out, and because the daughter asks her, "Can I bring the kids over to stay at your house?" and the mother tries to talk her, shame her into staying home with her kids until the very last of the punchline. You know the joke.
Well, that's not a joke. It's a dialogue.
Okay.
I present it as a dialogue. I won't try to go through the dialogue with you. I don't even have my book here, even if I wanted to read it to you. But
I'd be happy to tell it for.
A mother who is the daughter can't win. Either way she goes, the mother is heaping guilt upon her. Now, why do you suppose that is? Why do you suppose you have these jokes like, what's the difference between a Jewish mother and a Doberman pinscher, or a Jewish mother and a vulture? And the difference with a vulture, for example, is a vulture won't eat your heart out. These jokes are very, shall we say, insulting. That's the only word to use, and you could say degrading of the Jewish mother. But what they also do is they say Jewish mothers heap on a lot of guilt, and they are tremendously difficult in all of that guilt that they heap. But what is the source of that guilt and that possessiveness? I would argue that it's making fun of an overabundance of love. That's what I would argue. Why?
Yes.
Because
why?
They care so much for their children.
Yes.
And particularly care for their children because they have lived through, and you could say this is through the experience, particularly in the shtetl, all of the dangers that their children faced and that they themselves faced. In other words, a lot of that reflects a method of survival or a tool of survival that people, particularly who have been victimized, feel that they need to have at their disposal at the expense of. And sometimes one would argue the neuroticizing of, and even the ruination of their progeny. And that's what's been argued. You know, it's like the old joke about the Jewish mother who says, oh, you know, my son goes to a psychiatrist 5 times a week. He sees a psychiatrist. And mostly he talks about me, you know, as if this is something that I should feel good about as a mother. But at the same time, we can say, why has she led him into this necessity to talk to a shrink so much about her? And again, it's that possessiveness, that feeling of insecurity, and a lot of it heaping on guilt to make sure that the kid is in line and the kid toes the line.
2 comments on that. One is on the heaping on guilt. That looks to me like we're telling the world that the way that Jewish women control their children is through emotional manipulation, namely guilt, which is a very powerful emotion and one that you can manipulate people with. The joke about the mother who keeps telling this her daughter, you can't possibly leave your kids, you can't go out on a date, you got to stay home with your kids, you got to stay home with your kids, and then till finally the young girl, and this is right out of your book, the young girl says, okay, mother, I won't go out, I'll stay home with the kids. And the mother says, well, then how are you ever going to meet anybody? So
exactly.
It's
a completely conflicting message, and yet
yes,
on both levels, the mother's trying to say, even though those may be mutually exclusive messages, these are both of paramount importance. You have to be with your kids are important, but you also have to meet someone. And it drives one crazy.
That's what it does. And see, in psychology, Michael, we have something called the double bind theory, which is when you give people 2 mutually exclusive messages. And what we theorized for a long time, I don't know if it's still in vogue right now, is that when you do that consistently to a child, you make them crazy. And you used it in the vernacular. You said it makes somebody crazy. The famous joke, you know, that I may have heard from you many years ago is the mother who puts 2 shirts, a red one and a blue one, in her child's room, and the kid comes home and he picks up the red shirt and he looks at it, he says, Mom, I'm so happy. And she looks at him and she says, what's the matter? You didn't like the blue one? So it's right. No matter what he does, he's wrong.
In my book, I have it coupled with a story that was told to me by a name that may be recognizable to some of your viewers, if they lived in Marin or if they remember. There was a classmate of mine in Cleveland Heights High School, named Rita Abrams, who wrote a song called Mill Valley.
Yeah.
And it was a big hit. It became an anthem for Mill Valley, and it became copied in other communities and so forth. She told me a story that absolutely duplicates that joke. And by the way, the joke is told about a shirt. It's also told about a tie. A lot of these jokes morph and go into different. But Rita claims that her bubby, her grandmother, took her to a movie and said, buy some popcorn. And she said, no, Bubby, I'm not hungry. She said, no, buy some popcorn. I want you to get some popcorn. But I'm not, no, I said buy some popcorn. All right, so she gets popcorn and she eats the popcorn. And then the movie's over. They go out to dinner and go ahead and order something. I'm not hungry. How could you not? No wonder you're not hungry. You ate all that popcorn. Why did you eat all that popcorn? I mean, the grandmother, on the one hand, in other words, was telling her, eat the popcorn. SS mein Kind, as they say in Yiddish, eat my child, you know. And then on the other hand, saying to her, why did you eat the popcorn? It's an impossible double bind.
Yes.
And it's somehow associated strongly because of Jewish men, I would argue again, and because of their, perhaps, releasing some of their misogyny in the jokes and in the humor, saying, this is what we have to deal with Jewish women. It's Henny Youngman, take my wife, please. You know, it's that sort of thing. And yet, it makes people laugh, and it has a kind of quality to it. It's also, you know, and since I mentioned Henny Youngman, there's a lot of this Jewish humor that I try to outline in terms of the cadences and the locutions and really the way that, I mean, for example, when I interviewed Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Yiddish Nobel Prize-winning novelist, I said very seriously to him, Mr. Singer, do you believe in free love? And he said, I have no choice. You know, it's that, again, like Henny Youngman, take my wife, please. Or I went to the doctor. Doctor said, you're sick. I said, I want another opinion. He said, you're ugly. It goes like that, but it has also the double bind to it.
Yes.
It's the schlemiel figure, too, you know, who I write about. It's Rodney Dangerfield saying, I met this beautiful woman. She said, come to my home tonight. Nobody will be there. I went there. Nobody was there. You know, it's always the double bind.
You gave me a line there. I want you to elaborate, please, on the difference between a schlemiel and a schlemazel and a schmuck, because you go into that in your book, and it's lovely.
Well, the difference I start out with is outlining what a schmuck is and what a schlemiel is, because that's, again, the binary. The schlemiel, Sandy Koufax said it best, the great Los Angeles Dodger pitcher, when he was refusing to pitch on Yom Kippur, or as we said in Cleveland, where it was more of a fish holiday, Yom Kippur. And he said to Joe Garagiola, who was a great sports announcer, the St. Louis Cardinals and catcher, he said, well, I guess you could call me a schlemiel. And Garagiola had no idea what he was talking about. So Koufax gave a very cogent and appropriate definition of the difference between a schlemiel and a schlemazel. The schlemiel walks into a restaurant and somebody's sitting there with a bowl of soup and he knocks it over. The schlemazel, which means literally bad luck, is the one it spills on, okay? The whole soup spills on his lap. So there's that distinction, and schmagegile, schmo words, and schmuck. Lenny Bruce said, when he used the word, when he was first arrested on obscenity charges in San Francisco, he said, yeah, I used the word schmuck, and there was a Yiddish undercover cop who arrested me because he knew what the word really meant. And the word really means, essentially, it's a word for the male genitals, but the profane word for the male genitals. So you usually don't speak of somebody like that as being a loser, like a schlemiel would be. And yet it's strange linguistically how schlemiel has, people speak about schlemiel as even more than a loser or somebody who's just somebody you don't want to be around, who brings bad luck and the rest of it. Whereas a schmuck usually meant a villain, a bad person, a non-mensch. You know what a mensch is, just a good person.
So there's a connection there, excuse me for interrupting, there's a connection between the word that means the male genitals. I think the origin of it, actually, it means jewels, isn't it? A schmucker, and the jewels of the family of the male
jewels,
genitals, exactly. Right? So there's a connection between the genitals and bad. You're calling him a genital.
Yeah,
that's an interesting.
He's somebody who would in fact want to maybe steal diamonds or take them away from African natives. That would be the real original meaning. A villainous character like a schmuck. But it's evolved and it's changed in different ways. I used it in its traditional meaning. It's there's a movie called Dinner with Schmucks.
Yes.
And what did they mean by that? They meant a dinner with losers, with schlemiels really more than schmucks. The words have converged and become confabulated. It's like the word shiksa, which I also spent some time on because I'm fascinated by how it's evolved. It was once a very opprobrious and very pejorative word. Jewish mother said stay away from the shiksas, meaning stay away from the Gentile women, because they wanted to keep the tribe essentially, well, the tribe, and not
Right.
make it assimilative or not diluted or whatever. And then shiksa became as more Jews married and intermarried and became more associated with shiksas because they were writing things like Seinfeld, where you had shiksa appeal instead of sex appeal, or you have something like Sex in the City, where you have a shiksa, Charlotte, the character in Sex in the City, falling in love with a Jewish guy, so he calls her my shiksa. Became almost an endearing word, or a word. I saw a license plate recently that said shiksa. It's evolved into a more ameliorative, use a linguistic word, as opposed to pejorative word. So these changes evolve in ways that are fascinating. I didn't get into this because I thought it was something perhaps too radioactive, but there's another word, schwarze, which has evolved in different ways. It's a word which almost is interchangeable now with the N-word. It means black. It
Yes.
literally means black in both Yiddish and German.
Yes.
But at one time it was a kind of a friendly word, a word that Jews felt connected them with fellow Jews because they knew the Jews used it to talk about black people. Mel Brooks in Blazing Saddles uses it in a very positive way. You know, he's speaking Yiddish. They're black people that appear, the schwarzes and so forth. But it became a very pejorative word, and I avoided it for that reason. I think it's become too radioactive and too simply pejorative.
Do you think that young people of your daughter's generation, and I would want to ask you about your daughters and how they're doing, do you think that they are carrying on the tradition of knowing some Jewish words? Do they keep copies of Leah Rothson's book, The Joys of Yiddish, around? Or do you think we're losing that part of the culture? The general culture is losing that part of the culture of having these interesting and onomatopoeia-ish Jewish words?
I think there's been a lot of loss. You know, I wrote a very upbeat book, and a book that I think is hilarious if I'm to judge by what's being written about it and said about it, but I don't mean that to be immodest. But the truth of the matter is that we have lost a lot. We've lost a lot of what I would call Yiddish culture and understanding of Yiddish words and their meaning, even well-known, and words that have become almost part of the common lexicon, like schlemiel and schmuck. I could have written an elegy. But I didn't want to, and I'm glad I didn't. And I'll tell you why. Because despite all this loss, and as I said, it's a great source for a lot of the humor among a certain generation, there has been not only somewhat of an awakening of a desire to get back and understand this culture, but an awakening in me as an author, realizing a lot of young people who read my book told me, the first question I asked him, did you understand the Yiddish? No, but I got it. You explained it to me. Or I really did understand more of it than I thought I would. I mean, it's not a book that will weigh you down in Yiddish. In fact, I go to lengths to really describe almost any or every Yiddish word that I use. But I don't think young people have Leo Roston, whom you mentioned, who wrote The Joys of Speaking Yiddish, in their homes. I think, however, more of them maybe understand the humor than we realize. That's on the positive side. On the negative side, I had an experience that I write about in the book, and as I said, the book also involves a good deal of anecdotes and personal experiences. I was invited to do a Night of Jewish Humor a number of years ago with co-hosting with Larry King. And they had some really talented young Jewish comics, most of them young at the time. They had Steve Landesberg, who I think was really a funny, very funny guy. He's been deceased now for a number of years. But they had Rita Rudner, and they had Richard Lewis, and they had a number of people who are really funny comics. The only comic who was really ethnic and knew Yiddish and used it was someone who's not Jewish, Robin Williams, who came on at the end of the event and did a whole spritzing, and it was hilarious. And I realized that a lot of Jewish humor, and there are some very talented young Jewish comics. I mean, Sarah Silverman and Amy Schumer, who's half Jewish but identifies as Jewish, or Chelsea Handler, the same. And Gilbert Gottfried, a lot of people who use a different type of humor, but use it in ways that go back to the irony and the paradoxical nature of Jewish humor. They're not as aware of Is tapering off?
I beg your pardon?
I just saw a sign that said my voice is tapering off,
Yeah.
and I don't see your face anymore.
No, I can't see yours either, but I hear you fine, Michael.
You want to continue it?
Yes, let's continue, please.
Okay. Your viewers are not going to see my barely handsome face.
But they're going
I
to
think-
hear your lovely voice and the wonderful stories.
Well, I think I finished. I think we've
Well,
turned.
I'm not done. I'm not done yet because I want to come
No,
back.
I
if
mean, of that
oh, of
particular
that.
thread.
I see. Excuse me.
I think that young people are not as apprised of Yiddish culture or a lot of what these jokes mean, and yet there's a joke that I told on a Weekend Edition with Scott Simon. He asked me specifically for this joke. Oh, you're back. Good. I can see your visage now. It's a little blurry, but there it is. Can you see me?
No, I can't, but I can hear you.
All right. Well, we'll assume. We'll just move on.
Okay.
The joke is that there's. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Richard. What?
I wasn't saying anything. It must be a transmission issue.
There's a guy walking with his son. It's the middle of the 21st century, and a stranger, walks up and says, "Your son's a very handsome boy." Am I coming across or breaking up?
You're coming across.
Okay, good. So, total stranger says, "Your son is handsome," and the guy says, "Thank you." And he says, "What's your son's name?" He says, "His name is Shlomo." He says, "Shlomo?" He said, "What kind of name is Shlomo?" He said, "Well, he's named after his dead grandfather, whose name was Scott." Now, Jews name after the dead, and so Scott was an attempt to assimilate, of course, but Shlomo was going back. It's a cyclicity joke that kind of goes back to trying to renew or reinvigorate a Yiddish culture. And it's a very hopeful joke, I think.
It's a very
Scott Simon wanted it told because Scott was the name in the joke.
sure. It's a very positive joke.
Exactly.
I keep coming back to my head being full of these jokes about women and also the jokes from Jewish men about their wives. I want you to tell the joke about the funeral procession with the person walking the dog, because I think that's one of the sort of what I call retaliatory Jewish jokes.
It is. It's retaliatory and it's misogynistic, and it, from one perspective, can be seen as disturbing. Maybe it's a little bit of the Pollyanna in me, but I also see that joke as a different, in a slightly different way, slightly different. So the joke is that there's a long funeral procession, and there's a dog, and there's a casket, and there are hundreds of men following the funeral procession. And the guy stops the funeral procession, who is obviously the bereaved husband, and he goes to join someone who he knows vaguely, who's sitting in a cafe, and everything comes to a stop. And the guy who he knows, who he doesn't know that well, says, "Your funeral procession, what is this all about? You got hundreds of guys following, and you got a dog there, and you're going to have to explain that to me." He said, "Well," he said, "here's what happened." He said, "My wife was badgering me and screaming at me, and my dog wound up biting her, and she died." He said, "So this is a funeral for your wife?" He said, "Yes, it's a funeral for my wife." And what else? The dog? He said, "Yeah, the dog was the dog that bit my wife." He said, "Also bit her mother, my mother-in-law, who tried to interfere and protect her and was yelling at me too." So he said, "You mean that dog actually bit and was responsible for the death of your mother and your mother-in-law?" And the guy says, "Yes." He said, "And those 100 men in line?" He says, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "I don't know what to think, but can I get the dog?" He said, "You got to get in line with those 100 others." All right, so there's the joke in essence. Right?
So that's what
it is. It's a disturbing joke. But why do we laugh at? Why do you laugh at jokes? It's the old idea, and it's absolutely implicit in American humor. Guys joking about their wives and how their wives are difficult and how they have to put up with their wives' idiosyncrasies and all the rest of that. So you take that joke and you strip it down to its bare bones, and what it really means is it's a kind of a fantasy for men to escape what they see as the tyranny of their wives. And all of those jokes are much more innocuous if they came from Bob Hope or Georgie Jessel, maybe less than Bob Hope, but they came from more American humorists who were innocuous. But when you get into some of this Jewish humor, it's much deeper in its sarcasm, in its, vitriol even, you could say. But it's also a fantasy. It's a fantasy of being free.
What would be the flip side of that sort of, if you would see that as a retaliatory joke, what would be the flip side of a kind of anti-male, or the way the Jewish man is? What kind of joke might you throw at us?
Well, I like Roseanne Barr's joke. Roseanne Barr, of course, is Jewish, though she grew up in Utah, and it's like Bette Midler is Jewish and grew up in Hawaii. It's a very different kind of Jew than those who grew up in New york or Los Angeles and so forth. But Roseanne once said, "The way to a man's heart, through his chest." Or, Elaine Boozler makes fun of men by saying, she's talking about her tradition, ancient tradition as a Jewish person, and saying, one thing about my ancestors, it's amazing that they got through the desert the way they did, and it took them so many years because they didn't want to ask for directions, which is making fun of men.
Yes.
For the old stereotype of men refusing to ask somebody for directions because they know better, or they feel they know better. And so they're a lot less, well, except for through the chest, like Roseanne, they're a lot less tainted with a kind of venom or misogyny in that kind of counterpart, but they can be self-lacerating, and self-lacerating to an extreme degree. Think about Richard Lewis, for example, the old joke about male sexuality, that they have to pretend sometimes that somebody they're making love to is another woman. And Richard Lewis, who was always, berating himself, suffering. He said, "I was in love, making love to my girlfriend. I was pretending I was another guy," because he feels so inadequate. Or again, all that Rodney Dangerfield humor. My mother didn't want to breastfeed me; she just wanted to be friends. It takes the male and puts him in the position of being the schlemiel, or the trod upon, or the victimized, but also self-lacerating.
Well, what you've done, Michael, is through the use of humor, you've taught us about Jewish culture, you've taught us about Jewish customs, you've taught us about Jewish mythology, and you've made a really nice contribution by taking a serious topic and bringing your jokes to it, which I'm very appreciative of, and I'm sure all the people who listen are appreciative of. Do you want to finish with your favorite? Do you have one favorite joke?
I'm often asked about a favorite, and
Yes.
The truth is, don't really have a favorite, but there's a joke that I love to tell, and it seems to go over with audiences more than most. And it is a joke, interestingly enough, that I thought was exclusively Jewish, and you'll find out why when I tell it. But I heard the joke resurrected or reframed as a Catholic joke. So the joke goes something like this. A guy goes into a pet store and he sees a very scraggly parrot in an old, beaten-up cage. And he says to the owner of the pet store, "What's with that parrot over there?" And suddenly he hears the parrot say, "Horny," and says that word repeatedly, "Horny, horny." And the guy says, "Well, you get it. That's the only word that parrot knows. It's all kind of, I hate to use the word, but moth-eaten and scraggly. You can see for yourself." He said, "I'd like to get rid of it." And the guy says, "For how much?" He said, "You can have the parrot in the cage for $15. "Sold," says the guy. And he takes the parrot and he leaves. Not sure why he buys it, but he kind of feels sorry for it. All the way home, this parrot, which is a female parrot, keeps saying that word over and over again, "Horny, horny, horny." The guy takes it home, and one of his buddies comes over to see him. And he hears the parrot going, "Horny, horny." He said, "What's with that parrot?" He said, "Well, I got it in this pet store, and it was all scraggly, and I kind of felt sorry for it. I took it home. It's the only word it knows." His buddy says, "I know a guy who has these two parrots, and they daven. In other words, they say prayers in Hebrew." He says, "The parrots daven?" He says, "Yeah, the parrots daven. Let's put your parrot in a cage with these other two male parrots and see what happens. Maybe they'll learn some pious things, some Hebrew words and liturgy." So they do it. And here are these two male parrots on their perch praying, davening. One's got a little tallis on, the other one's got a tallis, that is a prayer shawl. They both got yarmulkes on. Female parrot's put in there and she says, "Horny," and the male parrots stop praying and say, "Our prayers have been answered."
Well, I think that's a great place to bring our interview for conclusion. Michael, thank you so much for being on the program today. Please send my warm regards to Leslie and to your daughters. And
Thank you, Richard, and same to your family, and always a pleasure to be with you. There's always been a warmth with you that I hope we can reinstill, because we haven't seen each other except in this Skyping in quite a while. It's been too long.
Well, when you come up for the writers' workshop here in Mendocino, please, let's get together.
And count on it.
Okay, and thank you all for listening to today's broadcast of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. We'll be with you again soon. Until then, this is Dr. Richard Miller telling you that good health is worth working hard for, and it's essential for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
An immortal broadcast. Thank you, Richard. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.